The morning I woke up to find my grandfather's handcrafted ranch mailbox gone, I thought it was a prank. But when I saw Marlene Henderson standing in her pristine driveway, hosing down MY family heirloom like it was contaminated, I knew this wasn't just another HOA power trip. This was war. My name is David, and for the past 3 years, I've been living in what I thought was paradise, a small lake cabin community called Willowbrook Shores, nestled in the mountains of Colorado. The cabin had been in my family for 40 years, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and finally to me when Dad passed away 2 years ago. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, my escape from the corporate world that had consumed most of my adult life. But paradise, as I learned, can become hell when you're dealing with an HOA president who believes she owns not just the community, but everyone in it. Let me paint you a picture of Willowbrook Shores. Imagine 23 modest lake cabins scattered around a pristine mountain lake, each property roughly 2 acres, connected by winding gravel roads lined with towering pines. Most of the residents were like me, people who'd inherited family cabins or retirees seeking peace away from city life. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and borrowed sugar without knocking. That was before Marlene Henderson moved in. Marlene purchased the largest cabin on the lake, a sprawling 4,000-square-foot monstrosity that she immediately began improving with manicured gardens, imported stone pathways, and security lighting that could probably be seen from space. Within 6 months of her arrival, she'd somehow maneuvered herself into the HOA president position, despite the fact that most of us had barely known we had an HOA. You see, Willowbrook Shores had been operating on a handshake and common sense basis for decades. The original HOA documents were buried in some lawyer's filing cabinet, largely ignored because everyone just got along. We maintained our own properties, respected our neighbors' privacy, and enjoyed the tranquil lake life our families had built. Marlene changed all that. Her first initiative was what she called aesthetic standardization. Every cabin needed to conform to specific color schemes. Every mailbox needed to be regulation black or brown. Every fence needed pre-approval. Every tree removal required a permit through her office. Yes, she created an office in her garage, complete with filing cabinets and a laminated sign that read HOA Administrative Center. Most of my neighbors grumbled but complied. They painted their cabins boring beige. They replaced their quirky handmade mailboxes with generic metal boxes from Home Depot. They trimmed their hedges into neat, soulless rectangles. But I couldn't bring myself to touch my grandfather's mailbox. Picture this, a beautiful piece of folk art, carved from a single piece of oak that my grandfather had salvaged from a lightning-struck tree on the property in 1987. He'd spent months crafting it by hand, carving intricate mountain scenes into the sides, bears fishing in streams, eagles soaring over pine forests, and on the back, a detailed replica of our cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. It wasn't just a mailbox. It was a memorial to the man who'd taught me to fish in that lake, who'd shown me how to identify every bird that visited our feeders, who'd passed on a love of nature that shaped my entire life. When Marlene's first letter arrived, demanding I replace my non-compliant rustic eyesore with an appropriate residential mailbox unit, I politely declined. I explained the sentimental value, offered to stain it a darker brown if the color was the issue, and assumed that would be the end of it. That was my first mistake. I assumed Marlene Henderson was reasonable. The harassment started small. Daily letters about community standards. Photos of my mailbox attached to violation notices. Certified mail threatening fines that somehow never seemed to follow any legal procedure I could identify. I tried calling the county to understand my rights, but the clerk just laughed and said, "Good luck dealing with that lady. She's called here about everyone in your neighborhood." Would you have caved to the pressure at this point? Or would you have stood your ground like I did? By month 3 of Marlene's campaign, I realized I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person trying to maintain community standards. I was dealing with someone who genuinely believed that ownership of the largest house in the neighborhood gave her the right to control everyone else's life. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was enjoying my coffee on the porch, watching the mist rise off the lake, when I heard the rumble of a truck engine. It was barely 7 a.m., unusually early for any kind of service visit in our quiet community. I watched as a white pickup truck pulled into Marlene's circular driveway, followed by what appeared to be a landscaping crew. Nothing unusual there. Marlene was constantly having work done on her property. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. They were unloading my grandfather's mailbox from the back of the truck. I set down my coffee so hard it shattered against the porch floor. Without stopping to put on shoes, I ran down my gravel driveway, my heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and rage. By the time I reached the property line between our lots, Marlene was already directing the workers to set up what looked like a power washer. "Marlene!" I called out, my voice cracking with emotion. "What the hell are you doing with my mailbox?" She turned toward me with this serene smile that I'll never forget, the kind of expression you'd expect to see on someone feeding ducks at a park, not someone who just committed what was obviously theft. "Oh, David," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'm so sorry you had to see this. But after months of non-compliance, I had no choice but to have the non-conforming structure removed. Don't worry, though, I'm going to clean it up before disposal. Even eyesores deserve dignity." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about removing a mailbox, she was talking about destroying a piece of my family history, and she was doing it with the kind of cheerful malice that made me question whether she was entirely sane. "You can't just take someone's property," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. "That's theft. That's literally grand theft." Marlene's smile never wavered. "According to Section 47B of our community covenant, any non-compliant structure that remains in violation for more than 90 days may be removed at the owner's expense. You received proper notification, David. Your failure to comply doesn't constitute an emergency on my part." I stood there, watching this woman, this stranger who'd invaded our peaceful community, directing workers to pressure wash 40 years of my grandfather's craftsmanship off the carved wood. The mountain scenes he'd so lovingly created were literally being blasted away, and Marlene was supervising it like she was overseeing the cleaning of a particularly stubborn stain. "I want it back," I said. "Right now, before you destroy it completely." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Marlene replied, checking something on her clipboard. "The removal process has begun, and for safety reasons, it needs to be completed. But don't worry, I've already ordered you a lovely standard mailbox that should arrive by Friday. Black, regulation size, completely appropriate for our community standards." That's when something inside me snapped. I won't lie to you, for about 30 seconds, I seriously considered doing something that would have landed me in jail. The image of grabbing that power washer and turning it on Marlene's pristine white pantsuit flashed through my mind with crystal clarity. But as I stood there, watching my family history being literally washed away, a different kind of anger began building. Not the hot, explosive kind that leads to regrettable decisions, but the cold, calculated kind that leads to long-term planning. "You're going to regret this, Marlene," I said quietly. She looked up from her clipboard with that same condescending smile. "Are you threatening me, David? Because I should mention that I'm recording this conversation for community safety purposes." I noticed, for the first time, the small device clipped to her jacket lapel. Of course she was recording. Of course she'd planned this entire confrontation to make me look like the unreasonable one. "Not a threat," I replied, backing away from her property line. "A promise." As I walked back to my cabin, listening to the mechanical whine of the pressure washer, destroying the last physical reminder of my grandfather's craftsmanship, I made a decision that would change everything. If Marlene Henderson wanted to play by HOA rules, then I was going to learn those rules better than she ever had. But first, I was going to find out exactly what gave her the legal right to steal my property. The next 3 weeks were a crash course in HOA law, property rights, and the kind of bureaucratic warfare that most people never imagine themselves capable of waging. I took a leave of absence from my consulting job and dedicated myself to understanding every single legal document that governed our little community. What I found was disturbing, but not in the way I'd expected. My first stop was the county recorder's office, where I requested copies of all the original HOA documentation for Willowbrook Shores. The clerk, a patient woman named Susan, who'd clearly dealt with HOA disputes before, helped me navigate the filing system and make copies of everything: the original covenant, the bylaws, every amendment that had been filed over the past 40 years. That's when I discovered Marlene's first lie. The Section 47B she'd cited didn't exist. In fact, there was no section in our HOA covenant that gave the president the authority to remove non-compliant structures. The actual enforcement procedure required a formal hearing, a majority vote of the board, and a 30-day appeal period, none of which had happened. But that was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into the documents, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about Marlene's authority. The original HOA board consisted of 5 members, elected to staggered 3-year terms. According to the bylaws, any major decision, including changes to community standards or enforcement actions, required a majority vote of the full board. I called each of the other 4 board members. 2 of them didn't even know they were still on the board. One had moved to Arizona 6 months earlier. The 4th, a sweet elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, who lived in a cabin near the North Shore, was horrified to learn what Marlene had been doing in the board's name. She told me the meetings were canceled because of COVID. Dorothy explained during our phone conversation. I haven't heard from her in over a year. She's been making all these decisions by herself? That's when I realized Marlene Henderson wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was running an unauthorized dictatorship, making up rules and enforcement procedures as she went along, counting on the fact that most residents wouldn't bother to research their actual rights. But my investigation led to an even more shocking discovery. I'd been wondering how Marlene had managed to get workers to remove my mailbox at 7 in the morning. Most legitimate service companies don't work that early, and they certainly don't remove items from private property without proper documentation. So I started calling local landscaping companies, asking if they'd done work at Willowbrook Shores. On my 6th call, I hit jackpot. "Oh yeah, the Henderson place," said Tom Miller, owner of Mountain Vista Landscaping. Weird job that was. She wanted us to pick up this carved mailbox from some neighbor's property and bring it to her place for cleaning. Paid cash, said it was some kind of community service project. Seemed sketchy, but she showed us official-looking paperwork. I asked Tom if he still had copies of that paperwork. "Actually, yeah," he said. "My wife handles our books, and she makes copies of everything for tax purposes. You want me to email them to you?" 20 minutes later, I was staring at the most brazenly fraudulent document I'd ever seen. Marlene had created fake HOA letterhead, complete with a fabricated address for her administrative center. She'd forged the signatures of the other board members on a removal authorization. She'd even invented a fake county code that supposedly required immediate removal of non-compliant decorative structures. It was an amateur forgery job that wouldn't have fooled anyone who took 5 minutes to verify the information. But Tom Miller wasn't expected to call the county to verify HOA paperwork. He was just a landscaper being paid to move a mailbox. As I sat in my cabin that evening, surrounded by legal documents and evidence of Marlene's fraud, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my grandfather's death, the satisfaction of solving a complex problem through careful research and determination. My grandfather had been a mechanical engineer, and he'd taught me that every problem has a solution if you're willing to dig deep enough to understand all the variables. I finally understood all the variables in the Marlene Henderson equation. But knowing the truth and proving it in a way that would actually stop her were two different things. I needed more than evidence of fraud. I needed a strategy that would not only get my grandfather's mailbox back, but would prevent Marlene from terrorizing anyone else in our community. That's when I remembered something my grandfather used to say. Sometimes the best defense is a really creative offense. And boy, did I have a creative offense in mind. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting of the Willowbrook Shores, HOA. According to the bylaws I'd studied so carefully, any board member could call such a meeting with 48 hours notice to all residents. Since I'd recently discovered that I was actually listed as an alternate board member, a position my father had held and which had transferred to me with the property, I had the authority to call the meeting. More importantly, I had the authority to set the agenda. I spent those 48 hours preparing for what I knew would be the most important presentation of my life. I made copies of every document I'd gathered: the original HOA covenant, the forged removal authorization, the email trail from Tom Miller, and a detailed timeline of every illegal action Marlene had taken since becoming president. But I also prepared something else: architectural plans for a project that would either solve my HOA problems forever or land me in serious legal trouble. The meeting was held at the Community Pavilion, a rustic structure near the lake where we'd traditionally held the rare HOA gatherings of the past. I'd expected maybe 10 people to show up in previous meetings. We'd been lucky to get a handful of residents who weren't too busy with their own lives to care about community politics. 21 people showed up. Every occupied cabin in Willowbrook Shores was represented. Word had gotten around about the mailbox incident, and it turned out that everyone had their own Marlene Henderson horror story. Mrs. Patterson had been fined for having the wrong type of bird feeder. The Johnsons had been threatened with legal action for painting their cabin a shade of brown that was apparently 2 shades too dark. Even Dorothy Chen, the only legitimate board member besides Marlene, had stories of harassment and intimidation tactics. Marlene arrived exactly at the scheduled start time, carrying her omnipresent clipboard and wearing a navy blue blazer that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. She took a seat at the front of the pavilion and looked around at the gathered residents with an expression of barely concealed annoyance. "I'm not sure why this meeting was called," she began, not waiting for anyone else to speak. "But I hope we can keep it brief. I have a conference call with our legal counsel at 7. I stood up, holding my folder of documents, and felt the weight of every eye in the room. "This meeting was called because you've been operating outside your legal authority for over 2 years, I said. "And because you committed theft when you had my grandfather's mailbox removed from my property without board approval or legal justification." The pavilion went dead silent. Even the evening sounds of the lake, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, the distant call of loons seemed to pause in anticipation. Marlene's face flushed red, but her voice remained steady. "That's a very serious accusation, David. I hope you have evidence to support such claims, because I won't hesitate to pursue legal action against anyone who makes false statements about my conduct as HOA president." "I have evidence," I replied, opening my folder, starting with the fact that there is no Section 47B in our community covenant. The section you cited to justify removing my mailbox doesn't exist. I handed copies of the original covenant to several residents who began flipping through the pages immediately. "I also have evidence that you forged board member signatures on removal authorization paperwork," I continued, "and that you created fraudulent HOA letterhead to deceive the landscaping company into participating in what was essentially a theft operation. The murmur that went through the gathered residents sounded like a physical wave rolling across the pavilion. Dorothy Chen was staring at copies of the forged documents with an expression of pure shock. That's not my signature," she said quietly. "I never signed anything authorizing mailbox removal." Marlene was beginning to look less composed. "There seems to be some confusion here about proper administrative procedures." "There's no confusion," I interrupted. "You've been making up rules and enforcement procedures for 2 years, counting on the fact that none of us would bother to research our actual rights under the HOA covenant. You've been running a one-person dictatorship and calling it community management." That's when I played my ace card. "But here's the thing, Marlene," I said, pulling out my architectural plans. "I've been doing some research into property boundaries and easement rights, and I've discovered something very interesting about the land around my cabin." I unfolded a surveyor's map that I'd commissioned the previous week, a document that had cost me nearly $1,000, but was worth every penny for the expression on Marlene's face when she saw it. According to county records, the original property boundaries for my lot extend 15 feet further toward the lake than anyone realized. That means the gravel road that provides access to half the cabins in this community, including yours, Marlene, crosses my property. The silence in the pavilion was deafening. "Now, normally, that wouldn't be a problem," I continued. "There's an implied easement that's been in place for decades, and I have no interest in disrupting anyone's access to their homes. But easements can be modified if the property owner feels that adjacent landowners are engaging in harassment or creating hostile conditions." Marlene was staring at the survey map like it contained the secret to nuclear fusion. "What exactly are you suggesting, David?" she asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, her voice contained a note of uncertainty. I smiled the same serene smile she'd given me while watching my grandfather's craftsmanship being destroyed. "I'm suggesting that unless my grandfather's mailbox is returned to my property in its original condition within 72 hours, I'll be forced to exercise my property rights and restrict access across my land. That would mean installing a fence and gate system that would require everyone in the affected cabins to drive an extra 2 miles around the lake to reach the main road." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the residents started talking at once, some demanding to see the survey map, others asking how this was possible, still others turning to stare at Marlene with expressions that ranged from annoyance to outright hostility. "You can't do that," Marlene snapped, finally losing her composure entirely. "There are easement laws. You can't just block access to people's homes." "Actually, I can," I replied calmly. "Implied easements can be terminated when the original understanding between parties breaks down due to harassment or hostile actions by adjacent property owners. I've already consulted with a property rights attorney, and she's assured me that your theft of my mailbox constitutes exactly the kind of hostile action that would justify easement modification." That wasn't entirely true. I hadn't actually spoken to an attorney yet. But the bluff worked perfectly. Marlene looked around the pavilion at the faces of residents who were clearly beginning to understand that her harassment of me could directly impact their daily lives. The political calculation was obvious. If she didn't return my mailbox, she'd suddenly find herself fighting not just me, but half the community. "Even if what you're saying is true," she said, "the mailbox has already been cleaned. The original decorative elements may have been damaged during the restoration process." "Then you'd better hope your homeowner's insurance covers theft and destruction of irreplaceable family heirlooms," I replied. "Because the replacement value of a handcrafted piece like that is going to be substantial." That's when Dorothy Chen spoke up. "Marlene," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of teaching high school students, I think it's time for you to resign as HOA president. This has gone far beyond community standards enforcement. This is harassment, and it needs to stop." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the pavilion told me everything I needed to know. Marlene Henderson's reign of terror was officially over. But the story wasn't finished yet. 3 days later, I was working in my garden when I heard the familiar rumble of Tom Miller's landscaping truck. This time, though, he was alone, and he was carrying something wrapped in thick, moving blankets. "Special delivery," he said with a grin. "Mrs. Henderson paid me double my usual rate to bring this back to you." She seemed motivated to get it done quickly. He unwrapped my grandfather's mailbox, and my heart sank. The pressure washing had indeed damaged some of the more delicate carving details, but the basic structure was intact, and most importantly, the mountain scenes were still recognizable. With some careful restoration work, the kind of meditative handcraft my grandfather had taught me during those long summer afternoons, it could be brought back to something approaching its original beauty. "She also wanted me to give you this," Tom said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a check for $2,500 and a brief note for restoration costs and any inconvenience caused by the administrative error. Administrative error. Even in defeat, Marlene couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what she'd actually done. But I didn't care about her inability to apologize. I had my grandfather's mailbox back, and more importantly, I had learned something valuable about standing up to bullies who hide behind bureaucratic authority. Over the following weeks, our community went through a period of healing and reorganization. Dorothy Chen agreed to serve as interim HOA president while we held proper elections. We established new procedures for board meetings, community decisions, and conflict resolution. Most importantly, we created a system of checks and balances that would prevent any future HOA president from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Marlene had wielded. Marlene herself became a model resident, quiet, polite, and scrupulously careful to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as harassment. Her transformation was so complete that newcomers to the community would never have believed she'd once been the neighborhood tyrant. As for my grandfather's mailbox, the restoration project became a winter-long meditation on craftsmanship, family memory, and the importance of preserving the things that connect us to the people we've loved. Some of the original carving details were lost forever, but I discovered that creating new ones, adding my own artistic touches to my grandfather's design, was a way of honoring his memory while making the piece truly mine. The most satisfying part of the whole experience came 6 months later, when a new family moved into the cabin across the lake. They were young parents, with 2 small children, and they'd chosen Willowbrook Shores specifically because they'd heard it was a community where people looked out for each other without being intrusive or controlling. As I watched their kids playing in the shallow water near their dock, supervised by parents who felt safe enough to relax and enjoy the mountain air, I realized that standing up to Marlene had been about more than just saving a mailbox. It had been about preserving the kind of community my grandfather had helped create, a place where people could live peacefully, express their individuality, and treat their neighbors with respect and kindness. Would you have been willing to risk your access road to save a family heirloom? Sometimes, the biggest victories come from being willing to play a high-stakes game when you know you're in the right. Today, as I sit on my porch watching the sunset over the lake, I can see my grandfather's restored mailbox standing proudly at the end of my driveway. It's not exactly the same as it was. Some scars remain from Marlene's cleaning process, and some of my own additions give it a slightly different character than the original. But in a way, that makes it even more meaningful. It's not just a memorial to my grandfather anymore. It's a testament to the importance of standing up for the things that matter, even when the fight seems hopeless. Especially when the fight seems hopeless. If you've enjoyed this story of small-town justice and HOA drama, Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more tales of neighbors behaving badly and the people who refuse to let them get away with it. Because, let's be honest, we all know a Marlene Henderson, and sometimes it takes a good story to remind us that bullies don't have to win. And if you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare, remember this: every bully is counting on you to give up rather than fight back. Don't give them that satisfaction. Until next time, keep standing your ground.